How do federal government roles differ in the executive and legislative branches? What skills are most valuable to professionals pursuing a career in Washington, D.C.? Welcome to the School of Public Policy's series spotlighting professionals with careers in public policy. Today, we invite you to join the conversation as we profile Wayne Palmer, former Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Mine Safety and Health Administration in the U.S. Department of Labor. Hi, I'm Whitney Sheridan, Director of Communications for the School of Public Policy at Penn State, along with Catherine Baumgardner, our Director of Professional Development and Student Engagement. Prior to his position with the Mine Safety Health Administration, Wayne served as Senior Manager of Congressional Relations at the Center for Presidential Transition, a nonpartisan source of information and resources designed to assist presidential candidates' transition teams. He has 13 years of experience working in Congress, where he's worked as the legislative director for Senator George Voinovich and Chief of Staff to Senate Republican Conference Chairman Rick Santorum. Welcome, Wayne. Thanks so much for being here. And I have to say that introduction only scratches the surface of your resume. So we're really excited to have you here and to talk more about your extensive background. So we appreciate you so much for spending the time to be here today.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Catherine and Whitney, for inviting me to have this conversation with your students today. And I'm really looking forward to it.
So this discussion is an opportunity for our attendees to be a part of the conversation and to talk to Wayne about his career path and experience. So we want to encourage you to join the conversation throughout this entire discussion. So don't hesitate to use that Q&A or the chat window at any point throughout the discussion. So Wayne, I want to start by asking you what inspired your decision to explore federal government work. You went back to pursue your Master of Government Administration after working in the private sector. Tell us a little bit more about what drew you to the federal government.
Sure. Well, I really wasn't sure what I wanted to do after graduating from Penn State. I entered the job market at a really bad time, but I landed with Dun & Bradstreet. It's the commercial credit reporting firm. And I learned a lot there in terms of corporate skills. I didn't realize how much I had learned until I left the company and entered grad school. But something was lacking in that job. I mean, for one thing, I love learning and I felt like I wasn't done with school. But more so, I felt that the nature of the work, it just didn't offer a sense of mission, purpose, contribution that I craved. I felt drawn to public service, and I ended up applying to several master's programs that focused on government. I'll never forget sitting with my boss and telling him I was leaving. I explained as politely and diplomatically as I could that I just didn't find the work fulfilling. He was a vice president with decades at the company, and he really didn't seem to grasp my motives for leaving. But in any case, I chose Penn's program for its practicality. It was a case-based terminal management degree focusing on government, where we shared professors with the Wharton Business School. And it was designed to produce practitioners more than theorists. So that, again, Dun & Bradstreet was a great learning experience, but it just didn't fulfill a deeper need that I had.
But you got your bachelor's in political science, correct, at Penn State?
Correct.
So you already kind of had that draw to public service when you were an undergrad, right?
I did, except
and to politics, and you were interested in politics, perhaps, right?
Somewhat more policy than politics. And interestingly, I ended up with more credits in history than I did poli-sci. I had a minor in Japanese, and I also pursued 2 honors degrees. One was in English and the other was in American studies. And so I was taking every possible liberal arts course I could. They invited me to join the honors economics program at one point. And I thought, how could I do a thesis that combines all 3, English, economics, and American studies? So I stopped at 2. But so yes and no, I'm not really so much of a political animal, surprisingly, given the career trajectory I've had. Again, it's more on the policy and the management side.
You're a bit of a renaissance man with so many different areas of interest, Wayne, which may certainly lend to the different directions that you've taken with your career. I'm just kind of curious to hear about maybe some of the experiences that you gained when you were working on your master's that really helped you to launch your career in the federal government. And
Sure.
how did you get your foot in the door? How did
Yeah,
you
so
take that package?
yeah, so I studying for that degree in that program narrowed my career path, obviously, but at Penn, I still wasn't sure whether I would end up in federal, state, local government, a nonprofit. Some classmates were interested in public finance, like municipal bond, which didn't necessarily interest me, but I learned of something called the Presidential Management Fellowship Program, a national program, and I competed for that and was fortunate enough to get accepted, which is what brought me to DC. I went to the PMF job fair, walked table to table, and I just talked to all of the representatives from the different agencies. And I happened upon the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which is a sub-agency at the Department of Commerce. And I learned that it was their first experience with hiring PMFs, and that they very ambitiously wanted to hire 9 out of only about 175 total PMFs in that year's class. And I knew that some agencies like Department of Defense, Health and Human Services, only allowed PMFs to rotate within the confines of their own department. And I wanted greater freedom than that. So I surmised that NOAA, not knowing any better because they were new to it, might allow more flexibility. And sure enough, they did. So at first, I spent some time working in congressional affairs, assisting members of Congress whose constituents opposed the siting of National Weather Service Doppler radar facilities in their jurisdictions. But then I rotated through the White House Office of Management and Budget, the Federal Election Commission, the Senate Steering Committee, and for Pennsylvania representative at the time, Rick Santorum, who served on the House Ways and Means Committee. And those last 2 rotations are what gave me my first taste of Capitol Hill.
So this all sounds, this is all while you're working on your master's degree, is that correct?
No,
this is after.
Right, you compete for the PMF as you are finishing your degree. I honestly don't remember, I don't know what the current deadline would be. I have to think that for your current graduating class, it probably already passed. But that's when you compete. And then if you become what they call a finalist, then in that summer after you graduate, that's when it's actually your responsibility to find a host agency on your own. They don't actually help you other than having that job fair.
Is it typical for someone to get this much experience in this many different roles? Because it sounds like such an amazing breadth of experience that you have in such at this point in your career, have had in that specific point of your career.
I do think that's unusual because most go into a single role that is indefinite in nature. And whereas here, the PMF, again, it's really designed to create a class, a cadre of future senior government managers. And the Office of Personnel Management, the agency that oversees it, their goal is for you to stay in government ultimately after your 2-year program is over. Now that could be in the executive branch, it could be in the legislative branch, it could be in the judicial branch, although that's rare. And I ended up doing that, although I switched branches, right? As soon as my 2 years as a PMF ended, it was just as then Congressman Rick Santorum got elected to the Senate, and I was able to get one of the final of 4 legislative assistant positions that he had to fill in the Senate. So yeah, I think that is unusual to get that cross training and those different experiences. Frankly, it was as much an exercise for me anyway in process of elimination or ruling some things out. So they're all great rotations, but it helps you figure out like, what might I really want to do? And perhaps what are some of the things I've discovered I don't want to do, which is maybe equally important.
It sounds very much like your PMF experience mirrored your educational experience, where you tasted a lot of different areas and you put yourself in places where you could experience a lot of different things so that you could figure out what you wanted to do ultimately.
Yes, that's true.
I want to remind our attendees that we're open for questions, so don't be shy. I know we have a lot of folks who wait until we get closer to the end, but we want to encourage you to join us with your questions, because Wayne is here to answer your questions about his experiences and his career path as well. So use that Q&A window or the chat at any point.
So while we're waiting for questions, Wayne, I'm just curious. I want to pick up a little bit on what we've talked about when you mentioned your legislative experience and some of the exposure you had during your PMF. What were some of the legislative agendas that you have been a part of and that you were instrumental in being impacted by? And what were some of the challenges in that position?
So each legislative assistant has an issue portfolio. Mine encompassed budget, tax, healthcare, labor, and most of the entitlement programs like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. And so that was the range of issues that I covered. Now, 4 years later, freshman Senator George Voinovich of Ohio lured me away to become his legislative director, which is a job where you're managing the entire legislative team. And now you don't have a discrete portfolio limited in issue or scope. You have to cover everything. Now, you have your legislative assistants who are subject matter experts working for you, but you have to be broad brush, pretty well versed in just about everything. 2 years after that, Senator Santorum asked me to return to his staff as policy director, and I later became his chief of staff. The challenges of each of the jobs, LA, LD, chief of staff, varied, but to succeed in any of them, or for that matter in the executive branch, you need to master certain soft skills. And maybe it's worth me spending some time on this while some of your participants are formulating their questions, but this is extremely important. There are soft skills that will, in large measure, determine your success in government. Number one is writing skills. Senator Santorum loved meeting with students and taking their questions. And often a student would ask, what's the most important thing I can learn while in school in order to succeed afterward? And his answer was, learn how to write well. And it is true. Writing is a foundational skill that you will use throughout your career. And it's important not just to be a good writer technically. You should strive to master different formats and styles. Just a couple of examples. Probably the most important is the executive summary, at least in that setting, where you distill the seminal points into the briefest presentation for a principal who is pressed for time. Learning to convey your points, your thoughts, using an economy of words is one of the best things you can do. Persuasive rhetoric is important in that arena. It's vital for formats like press releases, op-eds, talking points, what are called dear colleague letters, senator to senator letters, if you work in Congress. Speeches is another one. Policy papers are white papers. They're at the other end of the spectrum in terms of brevity and content. They're much lengthier, they're more detailed, with more technical content typically. And those are just a few of the examples. In the last 4 years alone, I have had to write such diverse documents as 2 to 3 page responses to highly political letters that members of Congress wrote to the Labor Secretary, where I needed to persuasively lay out the department's counter arguments, both factual and political, issue specific documents to prepare the Labor Secretary to testify before House or Senate committees. I had to provide background on the issue and the politics surrounding it, all in a format that's concise enough for him to digest quickly, because he would end up reading dozens of such documents before each hearing. I'd have to write hard-hitting questions that I planned to ask nominees when I was aggressively grilling them in mock hearings to prepare them for the real hearing when the time came. I even had to write last summer a 5-page legal declaration in response to a lawsuit filed against MSHA where the plaintiffs were seeking a writ of mandamus to compel us to issue a temporary emergency standard for COVID-19. I'm not even a lawyer, but I had to assemble counter arguments to the plaintiff's brief, and it got submitted under my signature to the second highest court in the land. If you told me in grad school I'd end up writing something like that, that was unimaginable to me. And so the variety of documents you might need to write is endless. On a related note, learn how to edit. Self-editing your own work, of course, is important, but soon enough, you are likely to find yourself managing others and needing to edit their work. I can't tell you how much editing I have done in my career. Before any document can go to a principal like a senator or a cabinet secretary, it has to be typo-free. Likewise, in the Senate, I never allowed a response to constituents going out to the public out the door before making sure it was perfect. If there are typos in your final product, in the mind of the reader, it calls into question your overall credibility on the substance, which is really what matters. Number two, in terms of soft skills, is public speaking, a close number two. There's a good chance you will be called upon to write or edit speeches. Now, I didn't know it at the time, but the most important class I took at UPenn was speech writing and delivery. You should learn to craft a compelling speech for yourself or for others, like a senator. We had speechwriters on Senator Voinovich's staff and at the Labor Department, and I had to work with them on crafting and editing speeches. You should also, though, learn to speak well extemporaneously without any written text. In my first 4 years as a Senate legislative assistant, I spent my days with constituent groups and lobbyists meeting in consecutive back-to-back half-hour sessions all day long. I would walk into a room often knowing nothing other than who the group was. I simply didn't have time to research each group's issues beforehand. So I'd walk in cold, listen to their issues, and engage in a dialogue. I needed for them to leave that office feeling like their voice was heard. I needed to sound at least somewhat intelligent about their issues and how the legislative process might apply to them. I had to convey some notion of where the senator stood on their issues, and bear in mind that some of the groups disagreed with the senator. Sometimes success simply meant that I was able to present compelling counter arguments, maybe in some cases even cause them to question the talking points their organization provided to them before they came in. Mm-hmm. And then lastly, in terms of soft skills, political skills, I'll quote one of your classmates, Kaj Althaus. He recently said something like, you can't separate politics from policy or nonprofit work in any form. Mm-hmm. I'm paraphrasing a little, but it resonated with me. And I'm not talking about how to manage a political campaign or anything like that. I'm talking about politics with a small p. And for some, political savvy comes naturally, others have to learn it. But whether you are in the executive branch, the legislative branch, or on the outside trying to influence the government, it doesn't matter how technically sound your policy position is. You will fail if you don't successfully build the right relationships, navigate the process and the politics of the issue adroitly. I'm talking about rallying like-minded stakeholders to the effort by forming partnerships and coalitions, leveraging whatever media channels are available to shape public opinion, to counteract your opposition's message, to build pressure on the relevant policymakers to favor your position, outsmarting and outmaneuvering your opponents in the legislative process if it's in Congress, or the regulatory process if the decision makers lie in the executive branch. And always be flexible. Each issue, each process is situational. Be prepared to work with erstwhile opponents. I mean, the old saying that politics makes for strange bedfellows is absolutely true. Allow that a given stakeholder on the opposite side of your issue today will turn out to be an ally on the next issue that comes along tomorrow. So I could talk all day about the—
And I want to follow up with you on that specific point in just a moment, because I know you've worked with so many different different people, and relationship building has been very important in your career. And I'm sure that's part of the soft skills that you're talking about. But we have had a flurry of questions coming in that I don't want to ignore. And that this is fantastic to see. A couple of them are in relation to talking about the PMF fellowship that you had been speaking about in earlier. So one of them is, what are some other paths into federal government other than PMF, such as internships?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So let me just start by saying generally, federal government jobs, every federal vacancy must be advertised on the website usajobs.gov. And it's like any other website. It's a bit clunky, but you can set up an account and create search agents. So let's say you want to work for the EPA. You can create a search agent with Environmental Protection Agency and then set it to ping you every whatever, periodically day or week with jobs that are in the EPA. And so look there for vacancies. Now the process then for actually applying for those vacancies, a couple of things you have to be prepared for. It's very structured, very formal, and it is a very lengthy process. I mean, it can take months, so you have to be patient if that's your aim. But speaking of internship, yeah, well, quickly, there is something though called the Pathways Internship Program, where while you're still in school, you can work for a federal agency while you're finishing your degree, be it undergrad or grad. And that gives you a chance to obviously work, get some money and some experience, but also it gives the agency and the managers there an opportunity to kick the tires a little bit to see what your performance is like and how you fit in. And we use that a great deal at MSHA, especially for the technical positions like engineers and chemists and industrial hygienists. So that's a really good program that is a more, I think, at an earlier stage of your career while you're still in school that you could possibly participate in.
And that was one of the other questions. What sort of internships, summer programs would you recommend for undergraduate students on a career path through federal government?
Yeah, Pathways is the federal government program. It spans all different agencies. Now, you might also in a summer find, if not an internship, possibly just a temporary job with a federal agency. There too, I would suggest that you start looking and applying early, well in advance of the summer. We're looking to do that. And there, though it's less structured and it's just an individual, internship slot, so to speak, or I'm sorry, temporary slot, so to speak, it's still a great opportunity for you to get some experience and get your foot in the door, have it on your resume and such. Yeah, and that now, if someone's interested in internships on Capitol Hill, that's a totally different game. And I won't attempt to answer that now because I don't think that's what the question was, but just know that it's very different on Capitol Hill.
Okay. Another question we have here, we kind of touched on this. Did you work between graduation and graduate school? Would you recommend going straight to grad school or taking time to work first, which we touched on a little bit, but maybe you want to mention that again.
That is actually a really good question. My graduate program at UPenn accepted very few applicants who had not worked in some sort of professional capacity since undergrad. Now, for me, it was 3 years at Dun & Bradstreet, again, in commercial credit reporting. But the reason they did that was they wanted you to get that real world experience. They found that it really helped equip you to compete and thrive once you got into that program. And look, it's funny, I'm talking to Penn Staters here. I think I can say this, that I paid my way through school, worked my way through school. I went to a state school, proud of it. It was a great experience and a great education. But before I went to Penn that summer, the program director sent me the list of the roster of all the other students. And I saw Oxford, Harvard, Princeton, obviously Penn, and I was a little intimidated. I really was. There was one other Penn Stater in my program, but mostly it was these, Ivy League schools and some international schools. Well, I got in there and it really didn't take long for me to recognize that I actually had acquired skills at Dun & Bradstreet I didn't realize I was acquiring. I ended up helping classmates with certain disciplines like computers and such. So yeah, look, ideally, I would recommend, if you can, to get some experience while in school as an undergraduate or between. And I really do think it'll equip you to thrive in grad school.
Great question. We also have one here. We know you got your master's at University of Pennsylvania. Here's one about, how do you feel about a master's in public policy? I gotta say, Catherine and I are a little biased on this one. But how do you feel, Wayne?
Look, the program I went through and then the PMF were the best thing that happened to me. Because again, I already knew that I had some sort of sense of public spirit and service. And I thought that degree would lead me to a career that would nurture and satisfy that. Well, it did. The one thing I will say, though, is I think that the more you balance the theoretical curricula in your program with some really practical skills as well, I think the better a program would serve its students and ultimately its graduates, just in terms of preparing them for what they are going to encounter in government at any level of government.
Did you find it difficult when you first entered the public sector after working in the private sector? So this is another good question after the one that we previously had about your time at Dun & Bradstreet.
I think my experience was atypical because of that PMF program. Mm-hmm. Rather than refer to myself, I'll refer to some of the other appointees I saw at the Department of Labor in the last 4 years, who came in as non-career appointees, never having worked in government at all, came from the private sector. And I will say the adjustment for them was much more jarring than it was for someone like me who had that structured program, the PMF, 2 years, a finite duration. And yes, I had flexibility to self-direct the rotations I did, but still it was like a gradual introduction and trying different things as being fresh out of grad school versus, again, coming in after years or decades in the private sector. It really is so different in the federal executive branch. You could more easily, comfortably make the transition into Congress from the private sector, especially on going to a committee staff, than you can the executive branch.
And we have an additional question about internships on Capitol Hill and about finding additional information, which you'd pointed out about the usajobs.gov website. So but is there any additional places where students might find information that you can point them in the direction of?
Yeah, so getting an internship on Capitol Hill takes a lot of entrepreneurship. Each office is its own distinct entity. Now, there is in the House a placement office, and in the Senate, likewise, the Office of Placement Services, I think it's called, where you can go on their website and again, look at current postings. I think you have the ability to set up search agents. And you will see some internships on there. But you also would be well served to look at some of the external organizations that have their own job banks and will list internships for Capitol Hill. So now it depends on your political affiliation. If you happen to be more on the right side of the spectrum, well, the Heritage Foundation has a job bank, and every week or so you can get their email, and you'll see in there internship for Republican Congresswoman so-and-so from Idaho, and it'll give a little description. There are other think tanks and organizations more on the Democrat side that likewise will show internships. And so, there are probably about a half dozen, and there are some that are in between. The Cato Institute is libertarian, so it's not really a conservative Republican one. So if you explore the different think tanks across the political spectrum and find the one that you think is most aligned with your political philosophy, you ought to be able to find some listings there. But quickly back to the entrepreneurship, a lot of people find their internships on Capitol Hill just now, setting aside the pandemic, but in normal times, by just going up there and being aggressive, being assertive, and working their network, trying to get conversations, informational interviews with congressional staff, and in which you say, look, I would love to do an internship. And it certainly helps if you are from the home district for a House member or the home state for a senator. That makes a huge difference. So if you do try to target any member who you have geographical connections to. It could be your home state, it could be where you went to college or grad school, anything like that, just so you can have that hook and say, yes, I'm very familiar with your state or your district.
Wayne, you just mentioned the different types of offices when you're talking about Capitol Hill. And this is something we talked about in another meeting. I was wondering if you could explain that a little bit more and how these offices operate.
Sure. So there are three different types. The first and most common is what they call the personal office. And the personal office is more than one office. It's your office on Capitol Hill in one of the 3 House or 3 Senate buildings. And then some offices back in your district. If it's a House district, maybe 2 or 3 offices. If it's a state, especially a large one, for Pennsylvania, we had 8 offices spread around the state. The purpose of that office is to support the senator in his or her legislative agenda and to serve the state, to serve the constituents. Everything from the meetings I was referring to earlier, where they come down to Washington and they want to meet with you to talk about whatever their issues are, to what they call casework, where your state staff will work with someone whose Social Security check didn't arrive or has some other challenge with government. So it's also a constituent service function. You also have leadership offices, and they differ based on the leadership position. So the leader of the party in the Senate right now, you have Mitch McConnell as the Republican and Chuck Schumer as the Democrat. They basically run their caucus. The legislative strategy, the political strategy, what occurs on the floor action and debate. The number 2 slot is the whip. The whip's office their job is to just whip the votes, make sure that their members understand what each vote is about and how their leadership would like the members to vote, ideally. The third ranking position, which my boss, Senator Santorum, held, is conference chair. That's where you coordinate the political messaging in the media. He collaborated with his counterpart in the House. And at the time, if the White House is occupied by the same party as this leader, which it was for a time during the Bush administration, coordinating messaging with the White House as well. And then there are others. There's the policy committee. They're the ones that's like the internal little think tank policy generating office, where they will produce policy briefs on specific bills that get introduced or specific issues. But so those, and so if you're a senator or House member and you are also in leadership, you have a totally separate staff that performs the functions of your leadership office. And then lastly is committees. Committees tend to be populated with more policy-oriented staff. And so that, their whole purpose is to, in the Senate, confirm nominees and process treaties. That's unique to the Senate. But in both chambers, of course, to handle any bills that get referred to them that fall under their jurisdiction, and mark them up, debate them, amend them, pass them out, discharge is the term, so that they could potentially be scheduled for a full debate before the floor of that chamber and ultimately possibly pass Congress and go to the president. They also, though, conduct oversight, which is, you have the separation of powers, of course, legislative and executive branches, and the oversight function in committees involves them calling a cabinet secretary, the assistant secretary of MSHA, in my case, over the last 4 years, up to Capitol Hill to conduct oversight and into any kind of issue, or sometimes it's a bad situation, something that happened, like the Boeing 737 Maxes. The Federal Aviation Administration got pulled up there, I don't know how many times, to testify. So that's the other function that the committees perform. And the experiences are very different working across all three of those, which I've done at various times.
Mm-hmm. I want to remind everyone we've gotten some great questions so far, but we want to encourage you to continue to ask those questions using the Q&A or the chat at any point throughout the conversation.
Wayne, I'm fascinated by the level of grasp that you have of navigating such complicated organizations. From what I remember in some of our previous conversations, you also had some experience in the consulting world, and when you were working with nonprofits. And I'm just curious about, and you also mentioned at the outset that you've been involved in the transition committees. Talk to us a little bit about how some of those soft skills you talked about earlier have really helped you to be successful in those roles.
Okay, sure. In consulting, honestly, or in congressional congressional affairs at a pharmaceutical company, it's really the same skills as on Capitol Hill as a staffer, except you're on the outside, right? And you have to use those skills a little bit differently. But I think the more interesting, at least to me in my career, question is the presidential transition. So I did spend, just before the Department of Labor, some time at the nonprofit, nonpartisan Center for Presidential Transition. I was in consulting, and a former colleague from Senator Voinovich's office, we had lunch, and she said that her organization was creating a subsidiary called the Center for Presidential Transition. And she said they needed a Senate expert to train the 2016 presidential campaign teams on how to stand up a government if their candidate won in November. And for me, that was an opportunity to once again be involved with the Senate, albeit from the outside. And so we began training, at that time, the Trump, Clinton, Kasich, Sanders, and Cruz teams. Now, once the parties chose their nominees, of course, it came down to just Clinton and Trump. Well, after the election, the White House called and asked if I would be willing to lead what they call a beachhead team at the Department of Labor. And that's the team that takes over a cabinet department at the beginning of a new administration. So on January 20th, 2017, I was sworn in along with about 15 others, and basically kept the department running until the Labor Secretary got sworn in on April 28th. At the same time, they asked me to shepherd the secretary through Senate confirmation. And I later got to shepherd another cabinet secretary, a deputy secretary, and an assistant secretary through their confirmation. That is one of the most grueling, stressful roles anyone can ever undertake, but it is also one of the most exciting and fulfilling. I would love to someday give a tutorial on to anyone who's interested on how that process works, but it is just a specific process only in the Senate, only when you have a new administration that needs to fill 4,000 appointments, but among those, I think it's about 1,200 that require Senate confirmation.
So Wayne, this led to your most recent position, right? So talk to us a little bit about that with Mine Safety and Health Administration in the Department of Labor. Tell us a little bit about that appointment.
Yeah, well, so after leading the beachhead team, once the secretary got sworn in, in April, he said, okay, I need a chief of staff, but he wanted a lawyer, and I'm not a lawyer. And I respected that. And he said, can you just serve as my interim chief of staff until I find the permanent one? I said, of course, absolutely, right? Well, a couple months hence, he said, okay, I found my person. It was, I think, June maybe of 2017. He said, where do you want to go? And I said, I would like to go to MSHA, Mine Safety and Health Administration. And he looked shocked. What he didn't know, though, is that mining in my family dates back to the first half of the 19th century in Cornwall, England. And then my ancestors came to the United States, and they were coal miners and silver miners and iron ore miners. And so that interested me. But mostly, though, it came down to the mission. MSHA's mission is simple: to protect the day-to-day physical safety and the long-term chronic health of 300,000 miners spread across 12,000 mines all across the country. But it was interesting, it was different because MSHA is an it's an enforcement agency, but it's incredibly data-driven. So we would dissect the data to identify spikes in certain types of accidents and certain types of injuries and, sadly, fatalities. We would then devise programs to strategically, surgically address those problem areas. So for example, powered haulage is defined in mines as the moving of people or materials in a mine. That includes everything from haul trucks as big as a house down to a regular old pickup truck or a conveyor belt that transports material through the mine. Historically, the data showed deaths related to powered haulage would yo-yo between about 1/4 and 1/3 of the total percentage annually. But in 2017, my first year there, and then again in 2018, fatalities from powered haulage spiked to about half of all types of fatalities. We responded with a multifaceted education campaign, and we initiated rulemaking, regulations. We worked with external stakeholders, such as a joint campaign to emphasize seatbelt use, where we collaborated with the National Stone, Sand, and Gravel Association, the Industrial Minerals Association, and in 2019, deaths related to powered haulage dropped significantly by half, roughly, to 26%. In 2020, they dropped further to 21%. That was the second lowest percentage since 1983. 2020 was also the first year ever that not a single miner died because they decided not to wear a seatbelt while operating equipment. So having data-driven, measurable outcomes like that is not common in government, but it was enormously gratifying to serve in that role and achieve those kinds of quantifiable accomplishments.
You mentioned that MSHA is a regulatory agency, and you have so much experience with the legislative branch. Did you, like, going into that position, were you already prepared for that position with the whole process of everything that you had to undertake in that new role, or was there a bit of a learning curve?
So I thought I was prepared. Look, working in Congress, you get some exposure to the regulatory process from the outside looking in, but I had no idea what it was all about until I got there. And there's a law called the Administrative Procedure Act of 1946 that governs, it dictates the process by which any regulatory agency will promulgate a rule. And if you don't follow that, not only are there immediate consequences, but in the long term, any regulation you promulgate is likely to not be legally durable when challenged in court, which anymore, pretty much every regulation immediately gets challenged in court. But I had to learn that regulatory process inside and out. And again, I freely admit, I really didn't understand it going in, but it's very, very different than legislative. And on that note, in recent years, Congress has deferred much more than it used to policymaking in the executive branch through rulemaking. And if you look at some laws like the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare as they call it for short, I believe it's something like 1,200 instances in that law. It says the secretary shall promulgate. And it, again, defers to the, in that case, Secretary of Health and Human Services to create rules that flesh out all of the details. Part of the reason Congress has maybe ceded that responsibility to the executive branch is that policymaking has become so incredibly complex. And when you're looking at a bill as comprehensive as something like the Affordable Care Act, Congress is just not equipped to fill in all of those details. And so they tend to defer to the executive branch. So yes, the regulatory process is very different. And I feel like I am much better equipped after the fact now to understand it, and whether I end up participating in it in the future from the inside or the outside, I've learned quite a bit.
So it's a learning process throughout the career path.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Great. I think that's encouraging for students who are considering going the same route.
Sure.
I want to remind everyone that we still have time for a few questions, so don't be shy. Use that Q&A or the chat at any point.
You know, Wayne, I'm thinking about your many different roles, and your most recent MSHA role was really one that was a political appointment, in the sense that it had a finite beginning and an end depending on how the election turned out. How do you approach a position that you know might only have a 4-year lifespan? Do you approach it differently than you might a job that you're looking to be in longer term?
You do. So, I mean, if it's a presidential term, 4 years, then you have to assume, I mean, you hope for 4 more years. You have to assume that you won't get 4 more years. So there's a certain rhythm or cycle to that where, and especially because things like the rulemaking process are quite protracted. I mean, it can take many months, even a couple of years, to actually finalize a new rule. You have to script that out in a way that you bear in mind that potential endpoint of January 20th, 4 years from when you started. But then look, if you, in November of the re-election year, see that you get 4 more years, great, you can ease up and perhaps, script out what you want to do over now another 4 years. But every administration handles it that way. So for instance, as you reach the end of year 4, the White House, and especially through the Office of Management and Budget, and an office called OIRA, which is the one that governs all of the rulemaking across the executive branch. It's like the clearinghouse for rulemaking. They will say, okay, great, we have 4 more years, let's script it out this way. But if it's going to come to an end, that's when they triage, they prioritize. They say, okay, we only have a couple of months now before Inauguration Day. So which ones do we think we can complete in that timeline? And which ones do we care about and want to complete? And so there's a triaging process after the election, if the election didn't turn out favorably to that administration. And that's when you find out which ones you're going to finish and which ones you aren't. Now, the incoming administration can elect to pursue some of those and continue with those or not. So yeah, there's a hard stop there potentially on Inauguration Day.
So a sense of urgency that comes into play, as well as a sense of flexibility that has to also be a part of your thought process.
Yeah, and just generally, I mean, you feel like, okay, on Inauguration Day, the clock has started. And however much time you have, you just want to accomplish as many things as you possibly can. And, in Congress, it's not quite the same. And if you work for a member who has a safe seat, you never assume that you're going to get reelected. But you're a little more relaxed about it, and you think maybe, okay, we might have more time here.
Wayne, out of all your experiences, what role have you loved the most? Was it MSHA, because that connection to mining and heritage and that feeling of, quantifiable change that you were able to see happen? Or maybe was it working with Santorum and that Pennsylvania connection?
Yeah, MSHA is a close second, but people ask me, the best job I ever had was Senate Chief of Staff.
Mm.
But for my home state, as I said, I took a 2-year hiatus for a promotion over to an Ohio senator's office. And sadly, Senator Voinovich passed away about 5 years ago. He was a very good man, and I really enjoyed working for him. And Ohio's a fine state, right? It abuts Pennsylvania on the western border there. They're very similar in population, in economies, in industries, but my heart wasn't quite in it the way it was working for my home state of Pennsylvania. Every morning I'd read the clips, the news clips that the press team would assemble, and they were very informative. But when I read the Pennsylvania clips, it was just so much more familiar. And again, my heart was in it just so much more. And as much as I loved being an appointee and the Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Department of Labor, the Senate Chief of Staff role gave me a great deal more autonomy. You are almost like a mini CEO. I had 63 employees across 9 offices, and it was up to me to manage that. I was like the business manager. The senator had other things to worry about, votes and committee hearings and fundraising and his leadership duties. He had to defer to me to do that. At the same time, I was still involved with policy and constituent service, which I enjoyed a great deal. I was more involved in media relations at that point, overseeing the press shop and their interactions with press releases and TV appearances for the senator and such. I also had to, with a very hard firewall between my official and my campaign duties, I also had to perform campaign duties, mostly fundraising. So on my own time, outside of the official Senate office, I would have to do a lot of fundraising events and such. So the variety and the autonomy, and again, that ability to work for my home state, that puts the Chief of Staff job for Senator Santorum #1.
Sure. We just have a couple of minutes left, but I wanted to ask you if you have any final words of advice for our current students or recent graduates who might be looking to pursue a path in federal government.
Yeah, I would say, above all, be flexible. I mean, maybe at this point, what you think is the exact career path you want to take. And maybe you'll follow that, and maybe you'll be gratified by it and do it for the rest of your life and retire from it. And if so, great. But even if that's what you currently think you want to do, keep your mind open to other unexpected possibilities that just serendipitously drift your way. If I hadn't gone to the Center for Presidential Transition, I would have missed out on 5 of the most interesting, grueling, but interesting and fulfilling years of my career at the Department of Labor. And so I just would say, be flexible, allow that. I mean, I have not yet settled in my next position, but I'm flexible in terms of which sector I might work in, public, private, or nonprofit, as long as the mission is one that I feel is compelling, where I feel like I can make a difference, I can achieve some tangible things. And so I'd say just, be flexible, even if you think you know what path you want to take.
And really quick, we have one last question I want to squeeze in here. What concentrated fields of public policy do you think grad students should focus on to prepare for increasingly changing globalized world, domestic political instability, and the after effects of the pandemic? That's a big question
for a couple of minutes.
I know.
So, oh, wow. All encompassing. I'm not sure.
I know.
I mean, look, the pandemic has, and for a while will continue to affect virtually everything we do. So if you're someone who wants to go into, say, international affairs, and that's your career track, whether it's in Congress or executive branch or a think tank, I don't know. You're going to have to view it through that lens for at least a certain time. If you handle healthcare issues like I did, well, clearly dealing with HHS and CDC and the agencies that are involved with that, you're going to be dealing with that, not to mention the private sector healthcare organizations. And so, yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard for me to answer that in a comprehensive way in just a couple of minutes. I guess it comes back to that question of flexibility, right? Well, I'll very briefly say this. Last March, I was in Las Vegas giving speeches at the largest trade association conference in North America when the president declared the state of emergency for the pandemic. Speaking of being flexible, I had to fly home, cancel 6 trips. I was going to go back to Mongolia. I was going to Japan, possibly Fiji and Australia for work. I had a bunch of domestic trips to safety conferences where I was going to give speeches. All of that got canceled. And all of a sudden, my job became all pandemic all the time. And so you have to be very nimble, very resilient, very versatile and flexible, and just turn on a dime and start dedicating yourself to something that you never saw coming. Now that thankfully doesn't happen too often, at least on the scope of the pandemic and the nature of the pandemic. But again, being flexible, I think, is really important in your career in federal service.
Well, thank you to our guest, Wayne Palmer, former Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Mine Safety and Health Administration in the U.S. Department of Labor. And thank you for all of your questions. They were so great today. We hope you'll join us for the next conversation in the Profile series on Wednesday, May 12th. I'm Whitney Sheridan, along with Catherine Baumgardner. For all of us with the School of Public Policy, thanks so much for joining the conversation and have a great day. Thank you.